America loves a good cowboy story. The lone gunslinger riding off into the sunset, the self-made man pulling himself up by his bootstraps, despite physics proving that's impossible. The myth of the rugged individual is baked into our culture. It's the idea that success is a solo act, that hard work alone determines destiny, and that needing help is somehow a moral failing. You hear it in every half-baked political speech about personal responsibility, and every libertarian Reddit thread insisting that roads should be privatized. But here's the problem. It's complete bullshit. Humans are by nature cooperative creatures. Civilizations exist because people work together, not because a bunch of John Waynes decided to tough it out in the wilderness alone, pilgrim. Even the most self-made billionaire, has as much of an oxymoron that is, stands on a mountain of taxpayer-funded infrastructure, public education, and labor they didn't do themselves. Rugged individualism isn't strength. It's delusion. And worse, it's a childish one. Because in reality, the individual only thrives because of the collective. Without a functioning society, these so-called self-made men are just guys with a gun and a can of beans waiting to get eaten by a bear. Rugged individualists love to misquote Darwin as well, almost as much as they love pretending they'd survive a week without DoorDash. They latch on to survival of the fittest, like it's a divine commandment, using it to justify everything from corporate greed to why they won't tip their server. In their version of evolution, life is just a battle royale. Every man for himself, no team-ups, and if you die, it's because you weren't fit enough. But here's the thing. Darwin never said that. Well, technically he did, but not the way they think. The phrase survival of the fittest wasn't even his. It came from Herbert Spencer, a 19th century philosopher who took Darwin's work and then twisted it into social Darwinism, the ideological equivalent of a guy who skips the reading and still thinks he understands the book. And if rugged individualists actually read Darwin, spoiler, they haven't, they'd find that cooperation, not ruthless competition, is what drives survival. Enter Peter Kropotkin, the Russian anarchist and scientist who spent years studying nature outside of a cigar smoke-filled Victorian drawing room. His book, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, obliterated the lone wolf fantasy by proving that species don't survive by outcompeting each other. They survive by working together. Ants build colonies, wolves hunt in packs, meerkats babysit each other's kids. Even plants communicate through root networks to share nutrients and warn of threats. Meanwhile, some libertarian in a bunker thinks he's proving self-sufficiency by stockpiling 800 cans of Spam. In reality, rugged individualism isn't evolution. It's maladaption. A creature that refuses to cooperate is a creature that starves when alone. The very forces of nature they worship prove them wrong at every turn. If rugged individualists were right, nature would be full of lone wolves, solo hunters, and animals too proud to ask for directions. But reality is a little different. Despite what every Ayn Rand fanboy wants to believe, survival isn't about who hoards the most resources. It's about who works best with others. Peter Kropotkin didn't pull his ideas out of thin air. He spent years observing animal behavior in Siberia and across the Arctic, where the idea of every man for himself gets you turned into a popsicle real quick. His findings? Cooperation, not competition, was the dominant survival strategy in nature. Animals that worked together thrived. The ones that didn't went extinct. Take emperor penguins. These birds survive brutal Antarctic winters by huddling together in massive groups and groups and rotating positions so no one individual bears the brunt of the cold for too long. Try that with a bunch of libertarians. First guy to suggest every man for himself freezes solid. Or how about wolves? Often misused as a rugged individualist symbol, even though they hunt in packs, share food, and even adopt orphaned pups. A lone wolf isn't an apex badass, it's just a wolf that's been kicked out of the pack. Nature's equivalent of getting evicted. Then there are vampire bats. Yeah, actual blood-sucking creatures that understand mutual aid better than the average CEO. They share food with starving roostmates, knowing that one day they might need a favor in return. Meanwhile, a capitalist would let you starve and call it incentivizing self-reliance. Even trees get it. Mycorrhizal networks, often called the Wood Wide Web, let trees share nutrients and warn each other about disease and pests. That's right, plants have a functioning mutual aid system, but somehow humans are still arguing about whether universal health care is too much to ask. Rugged individualism isn't just anti-human, it's anti-nature. Evolution didn't reward selfish hoarders, it rewarded cooperation. The strongest species weren't the most ruthless. They were the ones that were smart enough to have each other's backs. If rugged individualism were a viable survival strategy, history would just be a collection of stories about lone wanderers reinventing the wheel every generation. Instead, it's full of stories of civilizations that thrived by working together. Humans didn't survive because one caveman was really good at hunting. He'd get eaten the first time he sprained an ankle. No, we made it because our ancestors shared food, built shelters, and collectively decided that maybe freezing to death in a hole wasn't the best long-term plan. Take indigenous societies across America. Long before Europeans showed up with smallpox and manifest destiny, indigenous nations had economies based on reciprocity and communal resource management. The League of Five Nations, one of the oldest participatory democracies, functioned through collective decision-making and mutual aid. Meanwhile, rugged individualists today pretend like they can climb out of quicksand without someone else tossing them a rope. How about medieval Europe? Oddly the same deal. When disaster struck, plagues, famines, wars, people didn't survive because they hoarded resources. They survived because they had guilds, communal grain storage, and actual communal spirit. Even the wilds of American frontier wasn't tamed by lone cowboys. It was built by collective efforts, from barn raisings to mutual protection packs. The cowboy myth conveniently ignores the fact that they all depended on a supply chain, cattle drives, and someone to sew their boots. Let's talk about modern challenges now. A single person can't fix climate change, end poverty, or run a functional healthcare system. Hell, we can't even pave a road by ourselves. Rugged individualism falls apart the second the problem is too big for one person to solve, which is every major problem we have. Humans are wired for cooperation. The biggest irony? The very people screaming about self-reliance are the first ones to demand government bailouts when their bad decisions catch up to them. Turns out society is like Wi-Fi. No one notices it when it's working, but the second it's gone, everybody's fucked. If rugged individualism were real, billionaires wouldn't be lining up for government bailouts every time the stock market sneezed. But here we are. We're the same people who scream about personal responsibility suddenly develop amnesia when it's their turn to suffer consequences. The myth of the self-made man isn't just wrong. It's actively screwing up modern society. Look at healthcare. The US is the only developed country still debating whether people should die because they can't afford insulin. Why? Because rugged individualism insists that needing help is a moral failing. Meanwhile, every other industrialized nation figured out that a healthy workforce is a productive workforce. We call it personal responsibility, while they call it basic common sense. Or take disaster relief. When hurricanes, wildfires, or pandemics hit, who actually steps up? Not the free market. Mutual aid groups, grassroots organizers, and volunteers do the real work, while rugged individualists are busy looting FEMA supplies and whining about big government during COVID-19. Turns out during that pandemic, it wasn't libertarians in bunkers saving lives, it was community networks delivering groceries, raising emergency funds, and keeping people housed when the system failed. And let's not forget the supply chain. Every product in your house exists because of a vast interconnected web of workers, infrastructure, and public investment. Your Amazon Prime order didn't arrive via sheer force of will. It took truckers, warehouse workers, and a heavily subsidized postal service to get it there. Even the internet, beloved by rugged individualists who argue against collectivism, was literally created with taxpayer money. Reality check. No one is an island. Society is a team sport. And the only people who still believe otherwise are either billionaires selling a lie or fools buying it. Rugged individualism is like a bad reality show. Loud, dramatic, and completely staged. The people pushing it aren't surviving alone in the wilderness, they're benefiting from public infrastructure, collective labor, and government handouts while screaming about self-reliance. It's a myth sold to keep people divided, convinced that their suffering is a personal failure instead of a systemic design. Humans thrive through cooperation. We always have. From the first fire-lit caves to modern cities, we're survived not because we are lone wolves, but because we built packs. And the strongest communities, they don't hoard power, they share it. So the next time some billionaire tells you to work harder while cashing a tax-funded bailout, remind them no one pulls themselves up by their bootstraps. They stand on the backs of everyone else. Society isn't an obstacle. It's the only reason we're still here. Live long and prosper, bitches.